Well, basically, what we have in this PowerPoint, if you're having a little trouble orienting yourself, it is basically Plato's case for why the forms ought to be there. I mean, let's face it, if you're trying to convince somebody that there is another realm beyond this world that the soul is in touch with before birth, that our senses know nothing about, that we can only get a glimpse of using our reasoning abilities, you have to make a bit of a case that that world is there, right? So what we have here is a kind of synopsis of some of the reasons that were given. And the first part of this we looked over, says basically that because Plato believes knowledge, real knowledge has to be of what is eternal and unchanging. And here he's influenced by the pre-Socratic philosopher Parmenides. Plato thinks that the place and the objects of real knowledge, the place of knowledge is outside the cave. It's in this other realm. And in other words, if we have real knowledge of, say, geometry or mathematics, that knowledge concerns eternal standards, not just fleeting diagrams in this world. So we have this definition of knowledge, but so knowledge has to be enduring, always true, of things that are always what they are. For Plato, this is Heraclitus' world. Heraclitus thought everything's in change. He calls this a world, he uses the word of becoming. That is, everything is in a state of becoming something else. It's constantly changing. He says in order for us to have real knowledge, it has to be knowledge of something that's stable. And so the world of, this is our world, but the realm of the forms is a realm of existence or being with a capital B, And he calls us the intelligible world, or the world of the forms. That's the realm outside of the cave. So he's trying to convince us that there are non-relative standards for things like what a triangle is, what a circle is, that what it is to be a triangle didn't come into existence when the first human being thought up a triangle, but it's an eternal standard for him. And he also thinks there are eternal standards for things like what beauty is, what justice is, what moral goodness is. In fact, moral goodness turns out to be the chief form. So, I'm just going over what we've already gone over. So Plato argues then that these forms are the objects of knowledge. They're what the truths of mathematics or philosophy ought to be about. So, this is one concept of what philosophy ought to be doing. that ought to be getting us out of the cave. It ought to help us, recall knowledge we once had. Now, of course, that's a controversial view of knowledge. But later philosophers thought that we did have some knowledge at birth. And while Christian philosophers like Descartes didn't believe that we learned it in a previous life, like Plato and Socrates did, they believe that God put some innate principles in us, among which are things like moral principles, but also, a rudimentary knowledge of things like geometry. So, boy, this computer is running slow. So the knowledge has to be of what is eternal. And real knowledge then is about these forms for Plato. So that's why we call this the epistemological argument for the forms. It's the argument that the forms need to be there if genuine knowledge is possible. Episteme is a word for knowledge in Greek. And I didn't show you the parts of philosophy, but so the other argument that we looked at is called the metaphysical argument for the forms. And metaphysics has to do with the nature of reality. And so it basically holds that if two things share a common characteristic, then there's a general existing thing that they're both related to. In other words, if two particular squares share in common the property of squareness, then there must be a property which they share. In other words, that property, that general property, for Plato has an eternal existence. A good way to think of forms, the way I was taught, is if you think of them as blueprints. Like there's a blueprint in Plato's intellectual world, his intelligible world, for like what a square is. Also for what a desk or table is. And and things in this world, those particular desks you're sitting on, are poor copies of the perfect desk in the realm of the form that, and these are poor copies of the perfect square. So, so this argument says the forms have to be there because if things share a common property, then they're related to a general object, whether it be squareness or beauty or justice, and so, or something like largeness. So where we kind of left off last time was in this third argument. Semantics has to do with the meaning of words. Right? Syntax is how sentences and languages are structured. Semantics has to do with the actual meaning of words used, right? And what they refer to. And so the semantic argument basically takes a form like largeness or squareness or beauty itself to be the proper name of this general object in the realm of the forms. So, in other words, if there were a form for what all elephants share in common, the property of being an elephant, or, if you will, elephantness, then the general word elephant is the proper name of this general form, or the general word squareness is the proper name of that form for Plato, just as a proper name like Victor Morawski singles out one individual, or here in our slide, Gertrude singles out one elephant among others. You know, so the semantic argument says that names for general words, general terms, like beauty, justice, elephantness, squareness, those general names are the proper names of the form. And so particular things are related to these forms, and that's what gives them their identity as a square or a desk or a table or a beautiful thing. You know, and Plato uses the word participation. In other words, particular squares participate in squareness. That's his name for the relationship of a particular thing to the form that gives its identity. So for Plato, then, there are two existing realms as the world that you and I are in right now, the material world, along with Madonna, as I said. And this, in his little story, the allegory of the cave, is the world inside the cave, right? And things are real in this world, but for Plato, they're not as real as things in the realm of the forms. And so he says there's this other realm that our soul puts us in touch with. And really, it's our reasoning abilities that help us understand things in the realm of the forms. And there's a couple other points. I want to go over a few things in your book. So for Plato, we achieve real knowledge not so much with our senses, but with our reasoning abilities. It's by the slave boy's reasoning abilities that he is brought to see that, you know, to build a square twice as large as the original, you build it on the diagonal of the original, you know. And so that's how we as philosophers get in touch with this world that our soul once knew in a more intimate way. I mean, you know, Plato's story of things is through our reason, not through our senses, right? We can't see the form of largeness or squareness or even the form of density, right? They're outside the cave. We're inside the cave. But it's through our reason that we can kind of get back in touch with the forms. And Plato argues that the soul really longs to be there rather than here, because it's more like the unseen, eternal, you know, forms than it's like the body and like things in this world. So one of Socrates' conceptions of what philosophy is, and we don't tell you this when you sign up for 103, I mean for 102, because you might not sign up, but one of Socrates' characterizations is, well, philosophy is really a practicing for death. You know, and I would say, well, would you like to sign up for Philosophy 101? Because, you know, it's a practicing for death. we wouldn't get a lot of people signing up here, you know, and people ready to, you know, fill out your ad drop form. No, well, what did he mean? Well, he means, well, the soul really longs to be back there with the doggone forms. You know, it's trapped in this imperfect material world in the body, and it really longs to get back there, you know? So by practicing philosophy, by understanding these eternal truths, by letting our reason get us in touch with some of these things that the soul once knew, you know, we're kind of getting back, you know, to where the soul will be. And in fact, and I had this, I don't know if we're going to see that PowerPoint in the Phaedo. Plato, this falls under the heading of you can't make this kind of stuff up, folks. Plato actually argues that the soul wants to ascend through philosophy to be where the forms are and the gods are. But some souls get too attached to this material world. And he says it's like our chariots want to ascend to the heavens, but people who are too much into things in this material world are drawn back, you know, and they never can ascend to the realm of the forms, and they become like spirits wandering around graveyards, you know, after death, too attached to this world, you know. So, I mean, you got that going for you, you know, that there's less of a chance that you're going to become a disembodied spirit wandering around graveyards because you took Philosophy 101, you know. I mean, folks, you know, even though these people were brilliant, it doesn't mean that everything they said was. Plato also gives us the most extended argument for the existence of Atlantis, you know, too. So then the real philosopher, I like the way Bertrand Russell puts this. He says, you know, talking about beautiful things, right? Valentine's Day coming up. Hopefully some of you women will get roses and some of you guys will go out and buy some or have already committed yourself. But even a beautiful rose is, to a certain extent, things in this world are not perfectly anything, right? They're not, a rose is not perfectly beautiful. People are attached to this world, ordinary people, the ordinary man or woman on the street, and Plato knows this, Socrates knows this. They're concerned about beautiful things. Did a little thing for a company that did the Real Housewives of New Jersey. I think I mentioned that. You know, all of those shows, the Real Housewives or X, I mean, they are like really into things, you know. But the philosopher, argues Plato, is not just concerned about beautiful things because, you know, they're not perfectly beautiful, but about the quality of beauty itself. That is, the form of beauty. And where is this found? Well, it's found in Plato's, you know, other realm. So those are some of the points in this. So you can contrast the two worlds. This world is in constant flux. The objects aren't perfect. They're in a perennial state of becoming. And this is the world that the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus talked about. Only Heraclitus thought the whole of reality was like this. Plato says, no, Heraclitus, you got it right about this world. But then there was a philosopher named Parmenides who argued that really change is an illusion. Reality is stable and eternal. And Plato says, well, Parmenides, you were wrong about this world. Change is not an illusion. There really is change. Things are really changing in this world. But there is a changeless world beyond the realm of the senses that our reason can put us in touch with, the world of the forms. And that's where we find changeless, eternal things like the eternal standard for beauty or for squareness or things. And they don't change, right? I mean, what it is to be a square hasn't changed since the time of Euclid. And for Plato, this world is actually more real than the world our senses put us in touch with. I'm not going to do the divided line thing because your book doesn't discuss that very much. So, but to point out a few highlights here, we already discussed some of this reading because, you know, the story of the allegory of the cave is really the story about forms, among other things. And basically, on page 126, the reading is 126 to 140, just to highlight a few things about halfway down under Plato, the author says the most important single feature of his philosophy is the theory of forms. So that's why we study it. The Greek word for form is idea, and it's the word that we get our English word idea from, and sometimes they're called ideas, but again, the forms are much more than just mental concepts for Plato. They're really eternally existing objects in this other realm. You know, so you don't want to be misled by that. And for Plato, they are the ultimate reality. Things change, people grow old and die. Things are in constant change in this world. The forms, again, are eternal and unchanging in that second paragraph. So if you go down your author's note in the middle of, we're about 3/4 of the way down, 127, he notes the two-world theory. For Plato, there are two worlds, the world in which we live, which is in constant change, and the world, or a world of becoming, that is, everything's constantly becoming something else because it's in constant change. And then there's the world of the forms, which is the world of being with a capital B, where things exist changelessly and eternally, right? And he thinks true knowledge needs to be about what is changeless and eternal, not what is fleeting here. And he makes the connection with Parmenides for the world of the forms. And he talks down at the bottom about Plato's discussion of the form of beauty. You know, again, beauty itself is, for Plato, the only thing that's perfectly beautiful. And he makes this point in the little selection that we're not going to emphasize. Beauty always is, and neither comes to be nor passes away, waxes or wanes. And it's not beautiful in this way or that, but it's beautiful in a perfect way. Whereas even a beautiful rose in this world also has some ugliness in it. In other words, you look at a rose closely enough and you can see some imperfections, some ugliness, right? And they also a beautiful rose in this world isn't going to stay beautiful, right? You're lucky if you get a week or for things like that. So when he talks about the myth of the cave, and we've done most of this, but on page 131, the middle of the page is where he gets out of the cave, and he talks a little bit. And Plato explains some things, and he says, if you interpret the upward journey and the contemplation of things above as an upward journey of the soul to the intelligible realm. The intelligible realm is the realm of the forms that can only be known by our intellect, by our reason. Right? You grasp what I surmise since you were keen to hear it. Whether it is true or not, only the God knows, but this is how I see it, namely that in the intelligible world, well, the form of the good is the last form to be seen. For Plato, the forms have a kind of hierarchy, and I'm not going to ask you this on a test, but in other words, the form of a tangible object, like a desk, or a table, is in a slightly lower degree of reality than the form of a more abstract object like a geometric object, like squares. And above that are forms for objects that can't even be represented by a diagram, like moral concepts, like justice, like goodness, like holiness, piety. Oh, I said goodness. I didn't mean that. At the top of the heap, if you drew like a triangle, at the top of the heap of the forms, and this is what is represented by the sun outside the cave, is what Plato calls goodness itself, or the form of the good. Not God, but Plato thinks there's an eternal standard for moral goodness. And everything tries to approximate this. So it's tricky. The fire in the cave stands for the sun in this world. The sun outside the cave stands for not the sun, but the form of the good, which enlightens everything in Plato's eternal intellectual realm. So anyway, and he talks a little bit on 133 about the semantic argument. The best way to understand Plato's somewhat mysterious notion of forms is to think of them in terms of definitions. Yeah, you can see that Socrates, in a lot of these dialogues, is about trying to get an accurate definition of something, whether it be a definition of virtue, which is really what most of the Meno is concerned with, the definition of a human being, the definition of a concept like justice. The thought is we can know something for what it really is if we can define it. In other words, if I can define a triangle as a plane geometric figure with 3 sides and 3 interior angles that add up to 180 degrees, I've somehow captured in that definition the form of triangularity. I know what a triangle is in a real deep way. And so this idea of getting definitions for things, for Socrates and Plato, is really part of an investigation into what things really are. If we can get a definition that holds up, and not every definition does, right? While they're trying to define a human being, in one of Plato's dialogues, somebody says, well, a human being is really a featherless biped. And then somebody brings into the discussion a plucked chicken and says, well, this is a featherless biped. Is this a human being? And they say, well, you know, we got to go back to the old drawing board on our definition of human being, because that definition isn't going to fly. And Socrates in that video tries to show Thrasymachus that there are real problems with the definition that justice is whatever's in the interest of the stronger, that might makes right. He tries to show some contradictions with that. But the idea is, if you get a definition of something that holds up, you've got some real knowledge. If I can define a triangle, I know what it is in a way that I didn't before, right? If we can get a definition for justice that holds up, we've got some knowledge, And so, Plato's argument is that trying to get definitions for something is really an inquiry into the nature of things and trying to know what they are and trying to know what the form of these things is. Now, there are problems with the theory of forms. Now, you might think that things like interdepartmental politics, we can talk about people. This is a perfect institution, so none of your colleagues and nobody ever disagrees around here, But even in Plato's academy, Plato founded one of the first schools of philosophy. The logical successor, by far, the most impressive student Plato ever had in his academy, was the philosopher Aristotle. And yet, Aristotle and Plato disagreed about some things. Plato believes that within things there is the form that they participate in, right? Somehow, when this particular desk participates in the form of deskness, or a particular square participates in squareness, in each individual square there's embodied in that square the form of squareness. In other words, things in this world are a combination of a perfect form and imperfect matter. The point is, besides having forms in things, Plato also has forms in this other realm. But there are problems and arguments against this, which we're not going to go into, that make this separate existence of the forms to be questionable at best. And so Aristotle disagreed with Plato about the eternal existence of the forms. Aristotle thinks that there are forms in things, but a good way to illustrate the difference is, for Plato, if all the desks in the world went out of existence tomorrow, the eternal form of deskness would still be there in the intelligible world. Whereas for Aristotle, the only way a form can exist is if it's embodied in a particular object. So if all the desks went out of existence, so would the form of deskness for Aristotle. So we will see when we look at Aristotle's virtue ethics, for Plato, the point of ethics is coming to know the eternal form of goodness, or the form of the good better. Well, that's a problem for Aristotle, since for him, since there's no separate realm of the forms, there ain't no form of the good in a separate realm. So the point of ethics has to be something different, and Aristotle's much more down to earth. For him, ethics is pursuing happiness, pursuing the life that is the most happy. And he argues that it's the moderate life. So that is Aristotle's goal in ethics. Maybe I ought to ask if there are any questions. I think I might begin with, I hate to just do 8 minutes of a 25-minute video. We're going to look next time at a video on Aristotle's ethics, and there is a PowerPoint in there. I made a few of the first PowerPoints we're going to look at visible to you. The point is, most of the discussions of ethics by philosophers center around some stuff we're going to cover later. We're going to look at the moral theory of utilitarianism. And utilitarianism and a lot of other moral theories of philosophers try to answer the question, why is X rather than Y the right thing to do? In other words, they're called theories of obligation because they discuss and try to figure out how we decide what is the right thing to do, what is our moral obligation in a particular situation. But Aristotle, and even Plato and Socrates, were concerned more with ethics as what is it to be a good person? And specifically, what character traits characterize a good person? And are they something that we're born with, or can they be developed? And both Plato and Socrates thought that the focus of ethics ought to be on, what kind of person should we be? And this is what Socrates says he taught the youth of Athens. Don't care for, your job and wealth as much as you care for what it is to be a good person and for figuring out what that is. And so Aristotle's virtue ethics focuses more on traits of character. But it's, and the thing is, among modern day secular ethicists, his theory is still held to have held up over the years. That there is something right about thinking that besides worrying about how we get a decision procedure for figuring out what we ought to do morally, that there is something important about wondering what it is, what are the character traits that make us a good person, and can they be developed? And that's kind of what Aristotle's virtue ethics is concerned with. What are character traits? What should be the end of ethics? He's going to try to argue that it's the moral life, the ethical life, that's also, for us, the happiest life to live. Which is not what a lot of people think. So Aristotle's virtue ethics has held up fairly well over the ages, and so we'll look at that next time. Okay. So if you miss the roll, sign it. If anybody still needs a printout of the syllabus, I still have some. So stay warm. It's going to be cold. Even Monday it's supposed to be kind of like it is today. So, be careful. I mean, I wore a scarf today. You can, something like, you can easily get frostbite if you stay out too long in wind chills like this. So, be careful. All right, folks, take care, and we'll start out Monday, we'll look a little bit at this video on Aristotle's Ethics. Then, take care. Man, I wore my big coat down here if I'd have known it was this chilly. Yeah, take care. Be back in a couple of minutes, folks. Oh, hold it. I need